Hello again, everyone. So for today's video, what we're going to look at is the process of American entry into the First World War. Now, as I've outlined in my previous video, the First World War essentially starts as what can best be described as a relatively minor incident in the periphery of a dying empire, um, accidentally spiraling out of control and creating a European wide, and because of the massive colonial possessions that European countries uh, had at the time, by extension, global conflict. Um, but of course, the United States did not immediately enter this conflict, and with good reason. When the war began in the first week of August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson avowedly declared American neutrality in the conflict, and he had good reason for doing so. There was no great philosophical cause that the United States was deeply committed to that had been violated when the war started. And there was no great American interests that were threatened, at least not immediately. That, there were no stakes for the United States to get involved in the war, in other words. Wilson correctly deduced that the war had been brought about by, these sort of secret negotiations, these, behind the scenes treaties and all this other stuff, and fundamentally viewed the war as basically a overgrown European dynastic dispute. So he didn't feel like it really had that the U.S. had a stake in the war, and so he declared American neutrality at the outset. That does not mean that Wilson was neutral in terms of American foreign policy completely. He was, and as his predecessors had been, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, very committed to maintaining American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And to that end, he sent American Marines to a number of Latin American countries, including Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, during his presidency, during the first few years of his presidency, as a continuation of those banana wars that I mentioned previously that had really started in earnest under Theodore Roosevelt, as a result of the Roosevelt Corollary. But the area that he became particularly interested in, and which would ultimately play a direct role in America's entry into the war, was Mexico. Mexico had begun a revolution in 1910. And that revolution by 1913 had resulted in a new government under Victoriano Huerta taking place in Mexico City. Wilson regarded this regime as barbarous and murderous, and so he took a very keen interest in affairs in America's southern neighbor, in Mexico. And to that end, early in 1914, actually before the First World War even started in Europe, Wilson sent the United States Navy and 800 United States Marines to seize Mexico's principal Atlantic port, Veracruz, which American forces actually seized and held for over 6 months. This ended up having exactly the effect that Wilson had intended. It destabilized the Huerta regime and resulted in his regime being overthrown within the space of a year. However, this of course sowed considerably bitter feelings amongst many of those in Mexico who felt that the United States had unnecessarily and without provocation interfered in their country's internal, their own revolution, basically. And so, to that end, a revolution of poor farmers in the Sonoran Desert, led by this guy named Pancho Villa, began attacking American interests in just south of the border. They attack American trains coming out of out of the kind of borderlands areas, and crossing the border. And then in early 1916, in March of 1916, they actually launch a surprise raid on the American town of Columbus, New Mexico. This was the first time since the War of 1812 that a foreign enemy had actually invaded American soil and attacked American soil. This leaves 16 people dead. And as a result of this, President Wilson decides to send a large portion of the then very small United States Army, about 10,000 troops, under the command of General John J. Blackjack Pershing, south of the border into the Sonoran Desert to try to hunt for Villa and his rebels. They go into the desert and are there for the better part of a year. Ultimately, they come up empty-handed. They manage to kill a couple of Villa's lieutenants. One of the people who actually did so, notably, was future World War II Commander George S. Patton, who, in something that seems like it right out of a bad Western, walked into a Mexican bar, saw two of Villa's lieutenants, pulled out his ivory gripped revolvers and shot them, and then hung them on the hood of his Dodge touring car like he had just gone hunting deer. Not making that part up, not making any of that up actually. But other than a few notable and kind of outlandish exploits like that, nothing really notable occurred. Villa managed to avoid capture, and by January of 1917, Pershing was ordered back to the United States with his army, and so returned to the U.S. essentially empty-handed. Now, the reason that Pershing was ordered back, having beyond the fact that by that point it was clear that he probably wasn't going to catch Villa, was the fact that by that point the relationship between the U.S. and Germany had significantly deteriorated, and it was pretty clear that the U.S. was there was a very strong possibility that the U.S. would go to war with Germany at this point. And the reason why is because of events that had happened over the space of the previous 2.5 years. Basically, when the war began in August of 1914, the U.S. declared its absolute and avowed neutrality. But one of the things Wilson did not do, that many would argue later that he should have done, is he did not issue a ban on the sale of munitions or financial trading with belligerent powers. And initially, this was something that went both ways. So the U.S. had just come out of a recession in 1913, 1914, and so Wilson figured that it would be bad economically to deny American manufacturers and American banks the opportunity to profit off the European war, basically. And so to that end, very early in the conflict, American manufacturers began providing, and increasingly as the war became more of a stalemate and more expensive, American banks began stepping in to not only increasingly supply the Allied cause, but also increasingly to finance their war efforts. Now, you'll note that I mentioned the Allied cause and not everybody. There's a reason for that. Very early in the war, the U.S. did in fact trade equally with both the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and after December of 1914, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The reason why this trade by early 1915 increasingly becomes a very one-way trade with the Allies and not an even trade with both the Allies and the Central Powers is because the British, again, are still the world's preeminent naval power at this point. They still have the world's largest surface fleet. They still have the most battleships, the most surface vessels, what have you. And so the British do what had many navies, powerful navies, had done throughout history. They imposed a blockade on Germany to deny them access from goods from the outside world. Their basic idea behind this was quite simple. They wanted to suffocate Germany economically and isolate it politically through this blockade. And so as a result of this British blockade, which Wilson himself protested as a violation of American neutrality. Um, Trade between the United States and belligerent powers by the spring of 1915 is funneling pretty much exclusively into the armies of the Allied nations, Britain, France. And within a short period of time, the United States becomes a very important supplier for these countries. By early 1917, fully 40% of all of the arms and equipment being used on the Western Front was of American manufacture. Many of the shells that were fired from Allied cannons were American made. Many of the rifles and pistols and small and other types of things like that were made in the United States in large numbers. Pretty much the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force was equipped with American weapons, at least their pistols. And so, and not only that, but by early 1917, American banks were directly financing the war. As the war drags on and it becomes an increasingly very, very bloody stalemate, European nations begin running out of money and they begin approaching American financial interests for loans. So the U.S., as the war progresses, not becomes deeper entangled in the conflict, even as it portrays itself as decidedly neutral. By early 1915, the U.S. is increasingly becoming a vital part of the Allied war infrastructure. And so what that means is that the Germans, well, they need to find a way to try to address this, to rebalance the scales, if you will. And so what they decide to do is they can't challenge the British Navy on, they can't challenge the supremacy of the British surface fleet. And they really only make one attempt to do so at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, which is tactically a draw. But they do have another new and terrifying weapon that they do decide to use in large numbers to try to tip the scales and to try to give the British a taste of their own medicine. And that new weapon is the submarine. Now, submarines had been around by this point in various crude forms since the American Revolution, but only in the early 20th century had technology been perfected enough that they could be a reliable system that could be used in warfare that wouldn't also kill their crews in the process, as in the American Civil War with the case of the CSS Hunley. Um, and so the Germans began deploying submarines, or as they call them, U-boats, which is a shorthand for Unterseebooten, in large numbers to counter the British blockade. And they began sinking large numbers of Allied merchant ships. The problem with this from the Allied perspective and also from the American perspective is that U-boats are seen as a dirty form of warfare. They're seen as fundamentally violating the gentlemanly spirit of warfare because unlike say, a destroyer on the surface that's conducting a blockade, trying to intercept blockade runners, a submarine doesn't provide warning to its potential prey. Um, Historically, the way blockades would work is you would have surface vessels like destroyers or corvettes or frigates or what have you, and they would intercept blockade runners. They'd fire a warning shot, which is where the expression "a shot across the bow" comes from. And basically, that was their warning shot that you could either turn around or, you know, having been warned, you could now be sunk. Um, and that would be, considered appropriate, gentlemanly, if you will. Um, the second part about this, beyond the fact that, um, under a traditional blockade, you're supposed to give warning, you're also supposed to stick around and pick up any survivors if you do end up attacking the ship, that if they decide to press on and not turn around. Submarines can do neither of those things. In fact, the only real asset a submarine has is stealth, its ability to engage in surprise attacks. So the entire way that submarines are designed to operate violates this very basic principle of warfare that many consider to be established since antiquity. Um, they don't provide warning to the ships that they're attacking. They don't stick around to pick up survivors because they're too small to do so. Um, can barely fit the crew they have. And so that's something that raises a lot of eyebrows. But the Germans feel compelled to use this because they can't, again, challenge the supremacy of the British Royal Navy directly on the surface. So they begin using U-boats in large numbers in late 1914, early 1915. Um, in the spring of 1915, this ends up causing a major breach between the US and Germany when a British luxury liner, the RMS Lusitania, which was similar to, if not exactly the same as the Titanic. It's the same kind of ship. So, if you picture the Titanic, you're basically looking at what the Lusitania was. It sunk off the coast of Ireland, and more than 1,200 people, many of them women and children, die as a result of the sinking. So it's this massive maritime tragedy. Um, the thing about the Lusitania sinking is that of those 1,200 people who die in the sinking, 128 were American citizens. And so naturally, when these Americans are killed as a result of this German submarine attack, many Americans begin loudly demanding that the U.S. declare war on Germany. But President Woodrow Wilson hesitates, and he hesitates for two major reasons. The first reason that he hesitates is one, he doesn't think the U.S. is ready to fight this war at this time, and he has deep reservations about what effects it would have on American society, which is, of course, a society composed of immigrants from all the various corners of where this war was being fought or in what countries were involved in it at the time. The second reason is that the Lusitania was, by military standards, if not moral standards, a legitimate target. Um, the Germans claimed that it was carrying munitions, something which dives to the wreck site have since confirmed. And the German government, moreover, had provided warnings in American newspapers to would-be travelers that if they traveled on a British-flagged ship, entering British shipping lanes, that they were entering an active war zone and therefore did so at their own risk. So Wilson felt that the German government had, although the sinking, of course, was bad, that they had, provided at least some level of warning. So he decides to stop short of declaring war. He demands the German government immediately suspend the use of submarines, which they do so because at the time they're fighting a two-front war against both the British and the French, and on the Eastern Front with the Russians. And so the Germans agree to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. Um, Wilson then says if they resume this, that this will be considered a, quote, deliberately unfriendly act and will likely bring about American entry into the war. So the Germans agree at this moment, we don't want the U.S. to get involved in this war with us. This will be very bad for us because of America's enormous industrial and population advantages. And so they back off, basically. This actually helps Wilson win re-election in 1916. One of the campaign slogans that was used in the 1916 election, in fact, was "He kept us out of war," a slogan that would prove decidedly premature, as the United States would actually enter the war just a few months after Wilson was inaugurated for a second term in office. But anyway, so after the Lusitania sinking, for about a year or so, things seemed to go back to normal for the United States. But by this point, the situation in the war had deteriorated significantly for the Allies, and by early 1917, the Germans think that they've got an advantage. A couple of things ended up happening in that interim between the sinking of the Lusitania and when the United States eventually declares war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. And one of those events is that by this point, the war had become this terrible meat grinder. It was already a meat grinder by 1915, but it was really a terrible meat grinder by early 1917. In 1916, when the British launched a offensive in the Somme River Valley, on the first day of that attack, they lost 60,000 men, casualties, 16,000 killed and wounded. Over the course of that campaign, they would suffer over 500,000 casualties. In defending the fortified city of Verdun that same year, the French would lose over 1 million men. And the Germans would lose about 500,000 men killed or wounded in trying to take that city. So the rate of casualties had grown exponentially in the years that intervened between the Lusitania sinking and early 1917. Moreover, beyond this sort of these futile, almost suicidal frontal attacks that characterized the fighting on the Western Front, you also had, by early 1917, the fact that the situation on the Eastern Front had deteriorated significantly for the Allies. By early spring of 1917, the situation on the Eastern Front, which the Tsar himself had assumed command of early in the conflict, had gone so badly for the Russians that the Tsar is forced to abdicate, and a new provisional government under Alexander Kerensky takes power. Within a few months of that, Kerensky's refusal to end the war and take Russia out of the conflict results in yet another revolution in November of 1917, October in Russia under the old Julian calendar, which is why it's still referred to as the October Revolution, that results in the overthrow of Kerensky's government and the putting in place of a new communist government under a group that called themselves the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who himself had been secreted into Russia by German agents in 1916 to seed discord in one of Germany's principal enemies, a ultimately successful mission. So basically, by early 1917, the situation looks good for the Germans. The morale in the armies of the Western powers, Britain and France, is very low. They've taken a beating over the previous year. The French army actually mutinies in the spring of 1917 after a series of incredibly costly and poorly planned assaults, and is basically rendered effectively inactive for much of that year, forcing the British to take up the slack, which their population cannot sustain. And on the Eastern Front, with the overthrow of the Tsar and the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty and tumult and revolution, it appears that the Russians are looking for an exit from the conflict. And so it's at this point in early 1917 that the Germans think, well, we're on the verge of winning this thing. The Allies appear to be cracking in the West, and in the East, the Russians are clearly looking for the exits. And so the German government basically makes a rather bold and ultimately disastrous calculation for themselves. They basically determine, well, if we tighten the pressure on the British and the French by resuming this unrestricted submarine warfare, we can end this war quickly. We can strike that decisive blow that'll defeat the Allies and win the war for us. They do this knowing that doing this will likely result in the American entry into the war. But they basically calculate that because of the small size of America's military and the general lack of military preparedness of the United States in general, that it would take over a year for the U.S. to raise and equip an army that could affect the outcome. And they basically calculated that by that point they would have already won the war anyway. And so in February of 1917, the Germans resume unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean. This ends up resulting in the sinking of numerous American merchant vessels and the deaths of about 60 or so American sailors. And so this brings Wilson to the brink of declaring war on the Germans. But it's not really the final straw. The straw that finally breaks the camel's back is, in addition to the resumption of undeclared or unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, the straw that breaks the camel's back for Wilson is when the British intelligence services intercept a secret communique from Berlin to the German attaché in Mexico City, the German ambassador in Mexico City. This is sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann. This becomes known because of this as the Zimmermann telegram. And basically what the Zimmermann telegram does is it's trying to instigate a war on the southern border between the United States and Mexico. promising the Mexicans that in exchange for attacking the United States and thereby distracting, theoretically, the United States from fighting a war in Europe, that the German government would support them, provide them arms and equipment, and help them reclaim their, quote, lost territories, by which they meant the territories that the Mexicans had lost in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, the modern-day Southwest, California, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, um, Texas. And so it's these two things in concert, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and the sense of outrage that is produced by the contents of the Zimmerman telegram, that finally brings a deeply conflicted and reluctant President Wilson to finally decide to declare war. And so he decides that he's going to do that in early April, but he decides he's going to leave a decisive imprint on it. Wilson decides he's not going to make this a war for revenge for the U.S. And he decides, I'm going to leave my own imprint on this, and I'm going to make this a war that's worthy of fighting. And so when he addresses a joint session of Congress in early April of 1917, requesting a declaration of war, he frames America's entry into the war through the lens of the progressive movement, stating that the United States must declare war on Germany, not out of a spirit of revenge, but rather to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And so that phrase, to make the world safe for democracy, ultimately undermines the entirety of the American war effort and closely links the American military campaigns abroad to domestic reforms and progressive programs at home. This will prove to be, in the long run, both a blessing and a curse for the progressive movement, which will ultimately see both some of its most spectacular successes as a result of this, but also will end up um, basically expending itself and flaming out as a result of it in the long run. So that's how America basically gets into the war, into the First World War. What we'll talk about in my next video will be how the U.S. prepares to fight that war and what happens when American forces eventually deploy overseas, which the Germans were actually accurate about. It takes about a year. The U.S. declares war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. It isn't until the following April that American forces deploy in battle in large numbers. So we're going to look at, that space and what happens when American forces do eventually intervene in our next video.